what are the capabilities that are needed for organizations that compete in highly volatile environments, okay? And the idea was typically high velocity environments like the high technology sector, for instance. And so I teamed up with a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, I should say a former student of mine, who did a very interesting research on mountaineering. So his data was actually on expeditions climbing Mount Everest. And so we decided to team up and use that data to try to look at the issue of how organizations compete in highly volatile environments. And the analogy was basically that, as you have this expedition climbing Mount Everest, you go into these different phases of the climbing from quite predictable parts in the lower part of the mountain to highly unpredictable environments in the upper part of the mountain. And our idea was, how can we use then this study to look at what specific capabilities these organizations have to have in the different parts of the mountain, which, if you will, the analogy is, to organizations competing in highly volatile environments. And it was actually quite interesting because we found that indeed there were things that they did differently. So the typical routines of organizations, what in an organization we'll call them processes, were used all the way from the lower part of the mountain to the upper part of the mountain. But when you got to this very highly uncertain environment of the upper part of Mount Everest, this is what the climbers actually called the death zone. So when they got up there, what we noticed is that the successful organization, actually what they did is they had routines that were totally counterintuitive in the way. We call this recombinant routines. And the idea of recombinant meaning that there is human action that produces something that could not have been possible with the regular routines. But we identified several things like this and came to the conclusion that it was those sort of out-of-the-box routines, totally unplanned and even counterintuitive, that actually explain the higher performance of that organization in this highly volatile environment. And so the rest of the paper really tries to describe why is it that some organizations can produce these recombinant routines and the other ones could not. One of the things that we learned is that these dynamic capabilities are not necessarily replicable in the sense that we think of typical routines. Routines, you can replicate them, and this is the whole idea that why they become so entrenched in an organization. What we saw of dynamic capability are these sparks of, if you will, creativity that are basically driven by the roughness of the environment. How uncertain the environment is. You don't know exactly what it, you're in risk of dying in this particular case. So I think, there's part of this that cannot be easily replicated. And in that sense, you're saying, well, then what's the learning for the organization? But what we think it's important is that, is the emphasis on some solutions which are not coming from the way you conceive your routines. So this idea of coming totally out of the box with something that will be unthinkable, perhaps, if you follow the traditional routines, that's something that organizations can learn. And then the second thing is that the importance of having a small group of people within the organization, make those calls. What we saw in this study is that dynamic capabilities perhaps is not a concept that we should think at the organizational level, because to move a whole organization to do something that is totally counterintuitive with respect to the traditional routines is actually quite hard. So what we tended to see is that these sparks of recombinant routines actually, at the end of the day, resided in just a few people. And the few people that were at the edge of the organization, they were actually making those calls and making those very risky decisions to come up with something totally new. So, and I think that's also can be learned in the sense that, where do you put the decision power to actually do something different? And oftentimes what happens with organizations is that you have to go into, the approval of the committee, and the CEO has to approve this and everything. And this organization, what we saw is that they could produce those unexpected and, counterintuitive outcomes just because, there was not that line of authority behind, and the decision at the end of the day resided in a few people that had the skills and the guts to do it.